All right, so you sent us down quite the rabbit hole this time with all this inflation targeting stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, I gotta say, color me intrigued.
Yeah.
Seems like Wikipedia is our main source this time around.
Yeah, it seems like it.
But hey, sometimes the classics are the best, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like we're about to crack open, one of those big fat econ textbooks,
Yeah.
but hopefully with a lot more personality.
Way more personality. And
Yeah.
hopefully by the end of this, we'll all have a better grasp on whether this whole inflation targeting thing is like the economic holy grail or maybe it's just a shiny distraction. But first things first, what exactly is it? Imagine you and I are at a party, right?
Okay.
And someone who hasn't heard of inflation targeting in like a century asks us to explain.
All right.
What do we say?
Okay, so picture this. Central banks are like the party planners for the entire economy.
Okay.
And their goal is to make sure that the party doesn't get too wild.
Okay.
Too much inflation.
Right.
Or too boring, not enough inflation.
Right.
So inflation targeting is basically them saying, okay, we want prices to rise about 2% this year.
2%?
Yeah.
Seems oddly specific.
Yeah.
Why not just say, like, keep things stable?
Because a little bit of inflation actually helps keep the party going.
Okay.
It encourages people to spend money today rather than hoard it, knowing that it'll be worth less tomorrow.
Right.
And that spending keeps businesses humming. It keeps people employed.
Right. So it's all about finding that Goldilocks zone, not too hot, not too cold.
Precisely.
Okay.
And how do they try to control this economic party? Interest rates.
Okay.
They raise rates to cool things down if the party's getting out of hand, or they lower them to kind of heat things up if everyone's, looking bored.
Right. Interest rates, the economic party DJ, I love it.
There you go.
But here's where it gets really wild. This whole idea, this isn't some newfangled invention.
Right.
Our research says that its roots go back to the aftermath of World War I. It's like finding out that your grandparents were like secret ravers or something.
It's true. Economists were dealing with the aftermath of the war. Economies were all over the place.
Yeah.
And some really big names in economics were already tossing around ideas about how to kind of manage prices better.
And we're not talking about your like run-of-the-mill economist. This is Irving Fisher, the compensated dollar guy, right?
Yeah.
That always sounded like some next-level economic wizardry to me.
It was a very bold idea for its time. Imagine a balloon that automatically inflates when you blow more air into it.
Okay.
That's kind of how Fisher's system was supposed to work.
Okay.
If prices went up, the amount of gold backing each dollar would increase,
Okay.
theoretically keeping its purchasing power stable.
So prices go up, the balloon gets bigger, but everything inside the balloon stays roughly the same size.
Exactly.
Clever. But it wasn't just Fisher. Our research mentions John Maynard Keynes was also on this like pre-inflation targeting train back in the 1920s.
Absolutely. Keynes was another forward thinker. He argued that central banks should prioritize stable prices at home,
Okay.
even if it meant letting exchange rates do their own thing.
Okay.
It's like he was saying, let's focus on keeping our own economic house in order first.
Which in hindsight seems kind of obvious. But hey, that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating, seeing how these ideas evolved.
Right.
So we've got these early 20th century brainstorms, but it sounds like it took a while for someone to actually put inflation targeting into practice.
It did. Fast forward a few decades, and we find ourselves in the 1990s.
Okay.
That's when inflation targeting finally took center stage. And it all started with a nation that knows a thing or two about taking risks, New Zealand.
New Zealand,
Yeah.
the land of hobbits and bungee jumping.
That's right.
It's also pioneers of a major economic policy.
Indeed.
Talk about well-rounded.
Exactly. They were the first to fully embrace inflation targeting in 1990.
Wow.
And right on their heels came Canada in 91 and the UK in 92. Fresh off their break from the European exchange rate mechanism.
Yeah.
It was like a domino effect of economic experimentation.
Not all experiments are created equal, right?
Yeah, right.
What made the UK's approach so influential?
Their secret sauce.
Yeah.
Transparency. They were like, hey, we're not just going to do inflation targeting. We're going to explain every single step to the public. They even started publishing this thing called the inflation report.
Wait, hold up. The Bank of England, known for being about as exciting as, well, banking, decided to start, like, publicly explaining their every move.
Yep.
Now that's interesting.
It was a bold
It was a bold move.
and apparently brilliant.
Yeah.
Because our research suggests that this whole transparency thing wasn't just like some PR stunt. It actually worked.
It did. The UK's success with inflation targeting under this new transparent framework, it really got other countries thinking.
Yeah.
And soon enough, the idea started spreading like wildfire. From the land of hobbits to the halls of parliament, everyone's trying out inflation targeting. Were there any holdouts? Or by the time the U.S. gets on board in 2012, is it basically the cool kids table in the global economic cafeteria?
Well, the U.S. took their sweet time, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But while they were debating the merits, a lot of the world was jumping on board.
Yeah, okay.
Throughout the 90s, we saw more and more developed economies adopting it. And then, in the 2000s, it really took off in emerging markets.
So it wasn't just a trend for countries with, like, already stable economies. Emerging markets with maybe a bit more to prove were willing to give it a shot, too.
Exactly. And our research dives into some really compelling examples.
Okay.
Take Armenia, for instance.
Okay.
They adopted inflation targeting in 2006
Okay.
and have dealt with their fair share of economic curveballs since then. Global recessions, political upheaval, you name it.
Talk about trial by fire. How'd they fare?
Surprisingly well. They've managed to keep inflation relatively controlled through it all. And get this, the IMF actually praised Armenia
Wow.
for sticking to its inflation-targeting guns, even when things got tough.
Right.
They saw it as a sign of commitment and stability.
The IMF giving out gold stars for economic policy, that's got to be a good sign.
Okay, so Armenia's weathering the storm. What about Chile? I see they've been at this whole inflation targeting thing even longer.
Oh yeah, Chile's a veteran in the inflation targeting game. They started experimenting in the early 90s and went all in by 1999.
Okay.
And they had a much bigger problem to tackle than Armenia.
Okay.
Back then, they were grappling with inflation rates around 20%.
Ouch. That's not inflation. That's practically a price tag meltdown.
It was rough. But their central bank credits inflation targeting with helping them wrangle those prices
Okay.
and bring inflation down to a much more manageable level.
Right.
One of their central bank board members even pointed to how well Chile weathered the 2008 financial crisis,
Yep.
with inflation staying relatively stable
Right.
as proof that their approach was working. Okay, so we've got these smaller economies showing that inflation targeting, while maybe not a magic bullet, can certainly help navigate some choppy economic seas.
Yeah.
But what about the big kahuna,
Yeah.
the economic heavyweight? We can't gloss over the United States in this conversation.
Of course not.
Yeah.
But the U.S. is a fascinating case study because they were fashionably late to the inflation targeting party.
They were.
For years, they sort of, danced around the idea of an explicit inflation target.
Okay.
There were whispers, debates, but no real commitment,
Yeah.
especially under Fed chairs Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke.
Great.
It was the economic equivalent of will they, won't they drama.
Yeah, Greenspan, from what I read, was always a bit hesitant about the whole thing.
He was. Greenspan, always the pragmatist, liked having the flexibility to respond to whatever economic surprises came his way.
Right.
And he worried that committing to a specific inflation target would tie his hands.
Too rigid, too predictable, not really the Greenspan way.
Right. But then we have Bernanke, big believer in inflation targeting.
Because... And the winner is...
Team Bernanke.
Team Bernanke. 2012 rolls around, and the Fed finally takes the plunge.
Did you?
Setting a 2% inflation target. But here's the kicker.
Yeah.
They didn't just pick any old inflation measure. They went with something called the PCE, the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index.
A mouthful. Right.
Yeah.
But there's a method to the madness.
Oh, I'm sure there is. Lay it on us. What's so special about this PCE thing?
Well, it all comes down to what it measures and how.
Okay.
See, the PCE focuses specifically on how much prices are rising for us, the consumers.
Okay.
And it's got this kind of cool trick up its sleeve. It adjusts for what economists call substitution bias.
Substitution bias sounds like some serious econ jargon.
It's simpler than it sounds.
Okay.
Imagine the price of your favorite brand of coffee. It just skyrockets.
Okay.
What do?
Switch to a cheaper brand, obviously. I'm not made of money.
Exactly. And that's what the PCE captures.
Okay.
It takes into account that when prices jump, people change their buying habits.
Right.
Other inflation measures, they often miss this nuance.
So the PCE gives a more realistic picture of like actual inflation, how price changes are really hitting people's wallets.
Precisely. It's like the PCEs out there doing real-world grocery shopping,
Yeah.
while other measures are just browsing the aisles with blinders on.
Makes sense. But okay, let's get real. The U.S. jumps on the inflation targeting bandwagon, but surely not everyone's convinced it's the be-all, end-all solution, right?
Yeah.
There's got to be a counter-argument somewhere in these stacks of research.
Oh, there are definitely counter-arguments, lots of them.
Okay.
Inflation targeting has sparked some of the fiercest debates in economics.
Good. A little intellectual sparring is what we live for.
Right.
So let's break it down. What are the main selling points for inflation targeting? What do its fans see as the big wins?
Well, the first thing you'll hear is that it promotes stability.
Okay.
Keep inflation low and predictable, they argue. And businesses can plan for the future, consumers feel confident spending,
Right.
and the whole economy runs smoother.
Because no one wants to play roulette with their finances, right? Stability equals confidence equals growth.
That's the theory.
Okay.
And then there's the transparency factor, which we saw with the UK central banks.
Yeah.
They can't just operate in the shadows anymore.
Right.
They've got to explain their goals, their strategies, their reasoning.
Oh, right.
It's like holding their feet to the fire a little.
Accountability brought to you by inflation targeting.
There you go.
Interesting. What else?
Well, proponents also argue that this transparency acts as a kind of shield against political meddling.
Okay.
Politicians, they always want to, juice the economy,
Right.
especially when elections are right around the corner.
Right.
But with inflation targeting, central banks can say, sorry, we've got this target to hit. We can't compromise on that.
Right. No more printing money willy-nilly to win votes. Interesting. But you know what they say about something that sounds too good to be true, right?
Right.
Let's hear the other side. What are the big criticisms of inflation targeting?
Well, critics argue that this laser focus on inflation,
Yeah.
it can create a sort of tunnel vision for central bankers.
All right.
They might miss other warning signs in the economy.
Right.
Asset bubbles forming, unemployment creeping up
Yeah.
because they're so fixated on keeping inflation in that sweet spot.
So it's like staring at a single instrument on a whole dashboard. You might miss the engine light flashing.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's not just about missing other problems. Some argue that inflation targeting can actually exacerbate certain issues.
Okay.
Take asset bubbles, for example.
Yeah.
If a central bank keeps interest rates super low
Yeah.
to stimulate growth,
Right.
it can actually encourage too much borrowing and risk-taking.
Right.
The very things that fuel those bubbles they're supposed to be watching out for.
Ugh. So by trying to keep everything running smoothly, they might accidentally grease the wheels for a future crash. A bit of a catch-22.
It can be.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the whole debate about whether a little deflation is actually such a bad thing.
Inflation, as in prices going down. Isn't that like the economic boogeyman?
It's often portrayed that way,
Yeah.
but there's a school of thought, controversial though it may be,
Yeah.
that argues that a small, steady rate of deflation can actually be beneficial.
Okay.
Their logic.
Yeah.
If your money is becoming more valuable over time,
Yeah.
it encourages saving and investment.
Okay.
It's a different way of looking at things.
A completely different philosophy. So we've got the stability camp, the transparency advocates, and then those who think a little deflationary breeze wouldn't hurt.
Right.
What are we, the listeners, supposed to take away from all of this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
The reality is there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
Every economic policy has its pluses and minuses.
Right.
Passionate supporters and its staunch critics.
Sure.
Inflation targeting is no different.
So where does that leave us?
It leaves us with the knowledge that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Okay.
But by understanding how inflation targeting works,
Yeah.
the arguments for and against it,
Yeah.
you're equipped to form your own informed opinions
Right.
about the economic forces that are shaping our world.
Right.
And hey, you can even drop some serious knowledge bombs at your next dinner party.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe you'll even inspire a whole new generation of economists with like radical ideas about how to manage this crazy thing we call the economy.
I like it.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. And until next time, keep those economic engines humming.